Hey guys, in this video we're testing out 3 different methods on how to make crispy pork belly and the comparisons of each method. Broiling, salt crust baking, and pan fried. Also, if you end up liking this video, please consider subscribing. We do a lot of home-style cooking in this channel with some convenient twists and tips here and there. Anyways, hope you guys enjoy the video. Starting off, we're looking for a center-cut, skin-on piece of pork belly. Nice, balanced, alternating layers of fat and meat. About 3 pounds or 1.4 kilograms. Is good enough for about 4 people. The next step I like to do is blanch the pork belly in just plain water for about 10 minutes or so. It'll make things a lot easier when we poke holes and cut into the meat in the next step. So I started the pork off in hot water here, but if you start the pork off in cold water and then bring it up to a simmer, I think that'll be fine too. After the pork is done simmering, it'll be a lot easier to poke holes in the skin with a fork because the meat on the bottom will have stiffened up a bit. You don't have to go crazy with it, just poke as many holes as you can, as evenly as you can on the whole skin surface. And you only want to go deep enough to puncture the skin, but you don't want to go any further than the first layer of fat. After poking holes, we're going to lay down the pork belly skin side down on a flat tray filled with a thin layer of white vinegar. And we're also going to salt the meat section with a sprinkling of kosher salt, and I've also cut some slits into the pork for easier salt absorption. So the main reason why we're even bothering to do this hole poking and vinegar step is because we're trying to do work to break down the skin and convert the skin's tough collagen to a more broken down gelatin state. Breaking down the skin like this is denaturing proteins in the skin, breaking down the skin's protein bonds, and I think these steps will make the skin more readily puff up and crisp up during the last stage of this recipe. In this case, we're changing the pH of the skin to an acidic environment to break it down. That's why some recipes also call for, not also, but instead of vinegar, they add baking powder, which does the opposite and puts the skin in a more alkaline environment, which also works to break down the skin. So now we're going to set this in the fridge uncovered or covered, doesn't matter, for a minimum of I'd say 3 to 4 hours. So while the pork is chilling in the fridge, we'll go ahead and make the seasoning mix that'll go on the meat portion of the pork belly. And the Chinese style seasoning I like to use these days is 2 parts kosher or sea salt, 1 part sugar, about a half part of white pepper powder, 1 part 5 spice, and then about a half part powdered ginger. So I recently just added the addition of ginger because I recently learned that ginger contains enzymes that help break down and tenderize meat, or proteins, and I like my meat pretty tender, so I mean, who doesn't? Come on. I think it's a worthy addition. So now that the vinegar action is done, we're going to dump out the vinegar from the tray, cut some more slits into the meat to a depth of about halfway to 3/4 of the way down towards the skin. Sprinkle on the seasoning mix that we just made and rub it on all the surfaces of the meat, but not the skin. And now we're going to do a light sprinkle of salt and rub it on the surface of the skin and put these back in the fridge skin side up for 12 to 24 hours uncovered. So we're letting the skin dry out for this long because having less moisture in the skin will let the skin crisp up more easily. However, we don't want the skin to get too dry because we still need a little bit of water in the skin so that it rapidly turns into steam, forms air pockets in the skin, and then escapes, leaving behind a crispy skin during the final stage of this recipe. And after the 12 to 24 hours of skin drying time in the fridge, the basic pork belly preparation is done, and this part of the video is where we're going to change things up. All 3 methods will bake in an oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit or 120 degrees Celsius for 2 to 2.5 hours on a rimmed baking sheet, skin side up, and if you're using a full-size oven, put it in the middle rack position. For 2 of the methods, we'll be putting the pork belly in the oven completely bare, pretty much straight from the fridge, but the 3rd method will be using a foil and salt crust. Before putting it into the oven at the same time and temperature as the other 2 methods, we're going to get a sheet of foil and fold it up so it's at or a little bit above the skin surface, and pat it up so it's nice and snug with that meat. After that, pretty much just put a bunch of salt on the skin surface, even it out a bit, maybe 4 to 5 millimeters thick, and then it'll be ready for the oven. So after 2 hours, here are the pork bellies that were cooked naked, straight from the fridge. And I forgot to mention that you can wipe off the salt before you put these in the oven if you so choose. I don't think it'll make that big of a difference besides the skin just tasting saltier. But I'm a salty guy, so I like to leave it on. And here we have the salt-crusted, foil-wrapped pork belly. And we're going to remove the salt crust, and you can see here that it has transformed into one piece of salt crust stuck together, and we're going to wipe off some of the excess salt after we've removed that crust. Leave the foil on, and these will go back into the oven to get that skin nice and crispy. Alright guys, so now that that meat is fully cooked, looking thick and juicy, it's time for the first method, which is broiling. Put your pork belly back into the oven, same position as before, and crank up the heat to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 205 degrees Celsius. Look closely at the skin until you see it start to sizzle and bubble up from the hot pork fat rising and crisping up the skin. This will happen about 5 to 10 minutes in, depending on the size of your oven. And at this point, you'll turn on your broiler, and this is where you'll really start to see action as the skin pops from the steam, escaping from within the skin. As you can see here on the right side is the broiled pork belly. Very nice, airy, crispy skin. Rather large and somewhat uneven size on the bubbles though. But I think that's just because the uneven height of the skin, and you can see that some parts of the skin are higher than the other, so those parts will be closer to the broiler heating element, which is on top of the oven. There was no chewy skin underneath the crispy skin, which can happen sometimes if the skin wasn't dry enough during the crisping stage. The meat was satisfyingly juicy, tender, and not overcooked. Next up, we're going to do the pan-fried skin. After the initial baking, we're going to collect any of the pork fat that rendered out and put it in a skillet. Put the pork belly skin side down in the skillet and add more oil just so it rises to about the same level as the skin. Starting cold, we're going to heat this on a medium heat until you hear the skin popping. If the skin on your pork belly isn't flat, use a weight or just continuously press down on the skin so it has full, even contact with the oil. Pan-fried skin on the left, the skin has many tiny consistent sized bubbles, which is a texture that's a little bit more reminiscent of what you might see in a whole roasted pig hanging in the window of a Cantonese barbecue place. The crispiness is light and not teeth shattering. There's also no chewy skin underneath the layer of crispy skin, and the meat was also juicy, tender, and not overcooked. Finally, we have the salt-crusted bad boy surrounded with an armor of aluminum foil. Taking off most of the salt crust, same method as before, we're going to bake it in the oven, turn up the heat to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 205 degrees Celsius until the skin starts to sizzle, then turn on the broiler to finish it off. Right now you can see me cutting into the salt-crusted one. It has a pretty even, crispy, airy textured skin. Super moist meat. I mean, look at how juicy that looks. I'm getting wet just editing this video. This meat was by far the most tender and juicy compared to the other two. Unfortunately though, the skin did have a small layer of chewy skin underneath the crispy skin, and I think the reason is this. The salt crust and aluminum foil helped the pork belly cook more evenly in a moist environment because it was insulated and encased by the salt and the foil. However, because the salt crust was still on the skin during most of the low and slow baking process, it prevented any further drying out of the skin. During that initial baking, the skin still has an opportunity to have moisture evaporate to the optimal moisture content for getting the skin nice and crispy. When it came time for the skin crisping process, the salt-crusted skin had too much moisture and wasn't able to crisp up fast enough, and it also left a layer of that chewy skin underneath. So what I'll probably do in the future is skip the salt crust, do the foil, and crisp up the skin in the broiler if the pork belly is relatively flat and even in height, so it cooks evenly. Or if there's a big difference in the height, I'll pan fry it because it's just the most consistent and quick way. Thank you guys for watching the video, and we'll see you guys next time.